Hi everyone, it's Jeff with eatasquirrel.com, and today I'm going to show you how to make a squirrel skull from the head of a squirrel. The technique we're going to use today involves the use of a sous vide machine. Now if you don't have a sous vide machine, that's okay. You can substitute a boiling pot of water for this. So at the very minimum, you're going to need a Ziploc bag in order to put all of your squirrel skulls in. I've also got a couple sous vide weights to keep the squirrel heads at the bottom of the sous vide machine. Squirrel heads are lighter than water and they will float, so you will need a way of weighing them down whether you're using a pot of water or a sous vide. I've got this jar of squirrel heads that has been sitting in my refrigerator for a while, so I'm going to load these squirrel heads into the Ziploc bag after I put in my sous vide weights. So after we've got everything in the bag, we're going to squeeze as much air out of it as possible. In the past, I've also used vacuum pack bags, but I feel like they're pretty unnecessary and a waste of vacuum pack bags. I like to use those for recipes instead. With the bag sealed, we'll place it in the sous vide container. I've already filled this with water all the way up to pretty much the top, and we are going to set the sous vide to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. If you're doing this in a pot of boiling water, you'll want to have as slow of a rolling boil as possible. And for boiling, you'll want to boil for just about 30 to 45 minutes. Now, since we're using a sous vide machine here, we're gonna let this go for about 18 to 24 hours. The exact amount of time you'll want to cook for will depend on the squirrel head, but generally, smaller heads will require less cooking time in both the pot and the sous vide. And vice versa is true for the larger squirrel heads. So now we let the sous vide do its thing and just sit back and wait. Alright, so our bag of squirrel heads has been sitting in the sous vide machine for about 20 hours now, and it's time to take them out. You'll want to have a pair of tongs to take these out. Don't reach in there with your hands because remember, this is hot water and it can and will burn you. There might be some water in the bag even if you're using a vacuum sealed bag, so make sure to drain that out. And we're going to take the heads out of the bag next. For this step, I use a pair of kitchen gloves. This is optional, but I highly recommend it. Remember, your squirrels have been sitting in boiling water for the last 30 minutes or the last 18 hours, depending on which method you use to cook. So the heads will still be really hot. With each squirrel head, we're going to remove the soft tissue. That includes the skin, the muscle, and the brain. Begin by turning on your water faucet to cold water. At this point, all of the skin and the muscle should just come peeling off the bone. As you notice, the lower jaw of the squirrel will separate from the head, and the lower jaw itself will split into the left and right halves. Set this aside, we'll clean it later. Now, since I'm working with multiple squirrel heads, I'm going to remove the top layers of soft tissue for each squirrel head before going into more detail on each head. Now, for the more detailed work on the skull, I have taken off my kitchen gloves and I'm still running the cold water over the squirrel skull. I'm still noticing that there's a little bit of muscle stuck to the skull, so I'm just going to use my thumb and pry it off. The back of the skull is also susceptible to having a little bit of soft tissue there, so also run your thumb along the back and scrape off any of the excess tissue. Alright, so onto the top jaw, you'll want to take off the soft palate. That's just a little bit of soft tissue up there. And once you've removed all of the soft tissue that you can with your fingers, it's time to grab a screwdriver to get the finer bits of the skull. So you don't have to do this in any particular order, but on this one, I'm starting with the eyes. Make a circle around its orbit, and that will carve out enough space for you to poke out the eyes of the squirrel. Make sure you get any of the soft tissue that remains behind. We don't want that on the finished product. So we'll do the same thing for the other eye. We'll make a little circle, and the eye should just pop right out. You can do this with your fingers, but the skull is really sharp around the eye, and it hurts if you do a lot of squirrel skulls in a day. Now back to the underside, there's still a little bit of meat remaining right there, so I'm just going to pry it off with a screwdriver. The area around the squirrel's ears is also kind of tricky, so you'll want to use the point of your screwdriver to get in there and get any of the meat out. Now onto the nose of the squirrel. Like many other mammals, the squirrel's nose consists of a couple pieces of cartilage. These can be easily removed by hand. Once these are removed, we'll take our screwdriver and scrape along the nose, along the nasal cavity, and remove any of the soft tissue that's there. Now, we're also going to go into the nose with the screwdriver and scrape around there to remove any soft tissue that is in the nasal cavity, really deep in. A word of caution as you're doing this, make sure you're holding the squirrel skull with a delicate but steady grip, because it's really easy to accidentally crush the squirrel skull if you're gripping it too hard. I've saved the best part for last. We're going to remove the brain of the squirrel. Now, there's only a small hole where you can access the brain, and this is from the brain stem, which obviously is not included when we boil the squirrel skull. So we're going to take our screwdriver and swirl it around in the cranial cavity and break up that squirrel brain into tiny little pieces. I know this sounds gross, but it's the only way to do it. All the while, we're holding the squirrel skull under running water, especially holding the cavity under the running water. I'm giving it a little shake here in order to displace the little bits of brain that are in there that have been scrambled around by my screwdriver. And I'm going to repeat this process a couple times until all of the brain matter is out of the cranial cavity. And that's it for the head of the squirrel. Now remember, we still have two other parts, the left lower jaw and the right lower jaw. Luckily, these parts are a lot easier to clean. All you have to do is run them over a couple of times with your thumbs and index fingers to get any of the muscle tissue out. Repeat the process for the other half of the jaw. So once you have the lower jaw, upper jaw, and head cleaned, you are basically done at this point. Some people like the natural look of squirrel skulls, so they just leave it like this. If you want to make your squirrel skulls a little bit whiter, then stick around for the next step, which involves soaking them in hydrogen peroxide. Alright, so you're done removing the tissue from your squirrel skull. Now it's time to bleach the squirrel skulls. We're going to use hydrogen peroxide, and you can find this at pretty much any drugstore in the country. We'll fill the container a little bit with hydrogen peroxide, just enough so that when we immerse the squirrel skulls in, it will cover them completely. Begin by dropping the heads in the hydrogen peroxide solution. Some of them will float. We'll resolve this really quickly. But for now, we just want to get all of the pieces in there so that they can start bleaching. Now, the reason these squirrel skulls are floating is because the cranial cavity is full of air and there's only a little hole that the hydrogen peroxide can get into. So you can take your screwdriver and just poke the squirrel skulls gently until they're completely submerged. I use a screwdriver and not my bare hands because getting hydrogen peroxide on your hands is not the most pleasant sensation after a while. Now there's nothing to do but wait for another 24 hours. All right, so it's been 24 hours and we have perfectly bleached squirrel skulls. Now it's time to take them out and dry. Again, I'm using a pair of tongs to avoid direct contact of skin to the hydrogen peroxide because it's not the most pleasant sensation in the world. So take the squirrel skulls out, and for the heads, you'll want to shake them a little bit to drain all of the hydrogen peroxide out from the nasal and cranial cavities. Repeat this process for all the squirrel skulls, and they'll just sit on your drying towel or rack or on a bare surface for several more hours. So it's been a couple hours, and check that out. We have a perfectly dried, perfectly bleached squirrel skull that we made at home. No use of advanced chemicals, just stuff that you have in your household. And this is a great project for kids to get involved in eating squirrels and making projects out of squirrels. But it's also a really great learning experience, especially if you've never studied the anatomy of a mammal or a rodent up close. That's it for this video. Be sure to like and subscribe to our channel for more content. Thank you.